Philip IV of Spain was King of Spain and Portugal as Philip III. He ascended the thrones in 1621 and reigned in Spain until his death and in Portugal until 1640. Philip is remembered for his patronage of the arts, including such artists as Diego Velázquez, and his rule over Spain during the challenging period of the 30 Years' War. On the eve of his death in 1665, the Spanish Empire had reached approximately 12.2 million square kilometers in area, but in other respects was in decline, a process to which Philip contributed with his inability to achieve successful domestic and military reform. Personal life. Philip IV was born in Valladolid, and was the eldest son of Philip III and his wife, Margaret of Austria. In 1615, at the age of 10, Philip was married to 13-year-old Elizabeth of France. Although the relationship does not appear to have been close, some have even suggested that Olivares, his key minister, later deliberately tried to keep the two apart to maintain his influence, encouraging Philip to take mistresses instead. Philip had 7 children by Elizabeth, but only one son, Balthazar Charles, who died at the age of 16 in 1646. The death of his son deeply shocked the king, who appears to have been a good father by the standards of the day. Elizabeth was able to conspire with other Spanish nobles to remove Olivares from the court in 1643, and for a brief period she held considerable influence over Philip. By the time of her death, however, she was out of favor, following maneuvering by Olivares' successor, Luis de Haro. Philip remarried in 1646, following the deaths of both Elizabeth and his only legitimate heir. His choice of his second wife, Maria Anna, also known as Mariana, Philip's niece and the daughter of the Emperor Ferdinand, was guided by politics and Philip's desire to strengthen the relationship with Habsburg Austria. Maria Anna bore him 5 children, but only 2 survived to adulthood, a daughter, Margarita Teresa, born in 1651, and the future Charles II of Spain in 1661, but the latter was sickly and considered in frequent danger of dying, making the line of inheritance potentially uncertain. Perceptions of Philip's personality have altered considerably over time. Victorian authors were inclined to portray him as a weak individual, delegating excessively to his ministers, and ruling over a debauched Baroque court. The doctors who treated the prince at that time in fact diagnosed smallpox, although modern scholars attribute his death to appendicitis. Historians' estimation of Philip gradually improved in the 20th century, with comparisons between Philip and his father being increasingly positive, some noting that he possessed much more energy, both mental and physical, than his diffident father. Philip was idealized by his contemporaries as the model of Baroque kingship. Outwardly he maintained a bearing of rigid solemnity. Foreign visitors described him as being so impassive in public he resembled a statue, and he was said to have been seen to laugh only 3 times in the course of his entire public life. Philip certainly had a strong sense of his royal dignity, but was also extensively coached by Olivares in how to resemble the Baroque model of a sovereign, which would form a key political tool for Philip throughout his reign. Philip was a fine horseman, a keen hunter and a devotee of bullfighting, all central parts of royal public life at court during the period. Privately, Philip appears to have had a lighter persona. When he was younger, he was said to have a keen sense of humor and a great sense of fun. He privately attended academies in Madrid throughout his reign. These were light-hearted literary salons, aiming to analyze contemporary literature and poetry with a humorous touch. A keen theater-goer, he was sometimes criticized by contemporaries for his love of these frivolous entertainments. Others have captured his private personality as naturally kind, gentle and affable. Those close to him claimed he was academically competent, with a good grasp of Latin and geography, and could speak French, Portuguese and Italian well. Like many of his contemporaries, including Olivares, he had a keen interest in astrology. His handwritten translation of Francesco Guicciardini's texts on political history still exists, although interpretations of Philip's role in government have improved in recent years. Diego Velázquez's contemporary description of Philip's key weakness, that he mistrusts himself and defers to others too much, remains relevant. Although Philip's Catholic beliefs no longer attract criticism from English-language writers, Philip is still felt to have been unduly pious in his personal life. Notably, from the 1640s onwards he sought the advice of a noted cloistered abbess, Sor Maria de Agreda, exchanging many letters with her. This did not stop Philip's becoming known for his numerous affairs, particularly with actresses. The most famous of these was his actress mistress Maria Inés Calderón, with whom he had a son in 1629, Juan José, who was brought up as a royal prince. By the end of the reign, and with the health of Carlos José in doubt, there was a real possibility of Juan José's making a claim on the throne, which added to the instability of the regency years. Philip Olivares and his royal favourites. During the reign of Philip's father, Philip III, the royal court had been dominated by the Sandoval noble family, most strikingly by the Duke of Lerma, Philip III's principal favourite and chief minister for almost all of his reign. Philip IV came to power as the influence of the Sandovals was being undermined by a new noble coalition, led by Don Baltasar de Zúñiga. De Zúñiga regarded it as essential that the Sandovals be unable to gain an influence over the future king. De Zúñiga first began to develop his own influence over Prince Philip, and then introduced his nephew, Olivares, to the prince, then aged 10. At first, Philip did not particularly take to Olivares. Over the course of at least a year, however, the relationship became very close, with Philip's tendency towards underconfidence and diffidence counteracted by Olivares' drive and determination. Olivares rapidly became Philip's most trusted advisor, and when Philip ascended the throne in 1621, at the age of 16, he showed his confidence in Olivares by ordering that all papers requiring the royal signature should first be sent to the Count-Duke. Philip retained Olivares as his confidant and chief minister for the next 20 years. Early in his reign, Philip would be woken by Olivares in the morning to discuss the day's affairs and would meet with him twice more during the day, although later this routine declined until the king would hold only one short meeting on policy with Olivares each day. Philip intervened far more in policies during 1641–2, however, and it has been suggested that Philip paid more attention to policy making than has traditionally been depicted. Some recent histories go so far as to describe him as conscientious in policy making, although he is still criticized for his failure to make timely decisions. Philip himself argued that it was hardly appropriate for the king himself to go house to house amongst his ministers to see if his instructions were being carried out. The close relationship between Philip and Olivares was demonstrated by their portraits being placed side by side at the Buen Retiro Palace, an act unheard of in Europe at the time. Philip's relationship with Olivares, however, was not a simplistic one. The pair had many rows and arguments over the course of their relationship, both as a result of their different personalities and differences of opinion over policies. Initially, Philip chose to confirm the reappointment of his father's household to assuage Grande opinion. Under the influence of de Zúñiga and Olivares, however, Philip was then quick to place de Lerma's estates, expanded considerably during his long period as favorite under administration, and to remove from office Cristobal de Sandoval, Duke of Uceda, de Lerma's son, who had initially helped de Zúñiga remove from office his own father to advance his own position. Philip's initial announcements reflected an intent to reform the monarchy to the sober, moral position it had been under his grandfather, including selecting ministers whose grandfathers had served under Philip II. Philip has in the past been considered to be unimaginative in his politics. but recent histories have stressed the more radical elements of his first 2 decades in power. The early 17th century saw a febrile atmosphere in Spain, with numerous arbitristas offering various advice on how to solve Spain's various ills. This advice could, and would. Those debates extended to the nature of the monarchy. It has been suggested that the writers of the period who best capture Philip's view of royal authority were Justus Lipsius and Giovanni Botero, who promoted religiously inspired, Stoic self-sacrifice and a view of Habsburg family-led hegemony respectively, whilst at one level conservative, harking back in foreign policy to the period of Philip II, invoking traditional values at home. Philip's policies were also radical, rejecting the policy towards the rebellious Dutch that had held since 1609, entering into the 30 Years' War, and introducing a system of junta, or small committee, government across Spain in competition to the traditional system of royal councils. Following Olivares' fall from power amidst the crisis of 1640–43, the victim of failed policies and jealousy from the nobles excluded from power, Philip initially announced that he would rule alone, becoming, in effect, his own first ministry. The junta system of government began to be dismantled in favor of the older council system. In due course, however, this personal rule reverted to rule through a royal favorite, initially Luis de Haro, a nephew of Olivares and a childhood playmate of Philip's, and the counter-reform of the committee system halted. De Haro has not been highly regarded by historians. The comment of one, that De Haro was the embodiment of mediocrity, is not atypical. After de Haro's death in 1661, Olivares' son-in-law, the Duke of Medina de las Torres, became royal favorite in his place. Foreign policy and the 30 Years' War. Philip was to reign through the majority of the 30 Years' War in Europe, a turbulent period of military history. In Philip III's final years, Baltasar de Zuniga had convinced him to intervene militarily in Bohemia and the electorate of the Palatinate on the side of Emperor Ferdinand II. Once Philip himself came to power, he was convinced by de Zuniga, appointed his principal foreign minister, and Olivares that he should commit Spain to a more aggressive foreign policy in alliance with the Holy Roman Empire. This would lead Philip to renew hostilities with the Dutch in 1621 in an attempt to bring the provinces to the negotiating table with the aim of achieving a peace treaty favorable to Spanish global interests. Philip's government would pursue a Netherlands first strategy throughout the war until 1643. Despite this shift in policy, Philip does not seem to have been particularly bellicose. Early on he noted that having inherited such a large empire, war somewhere across his domains was an inevitable condition, and he appeared genuinely upset when he came to power and contemplated how much the people of Castile had paid, in blood, to support the wars of his royal predecessors. The 1620s were good years for Spanish foreign policy. The war with the Dutch went well, albeit at great expense, culminating in the retaking of the key city of Breda in 1624. By the end of the decade, however, Philip's government was faced with the question of whether to prioritize the war in Flanders or Spain's relationship with France during the War of the Mantuan Succession. Philip's advisers recommended prioritizing the war in Flanders, taking action to safeguard the Spanish road to the Netherlands but at the cost of antagonizing Louis XIII. Strategically, this was to prove a disaster. Despite fresh Spanish successes in the mid-1630s, in particular, the triumph of Philip's government in raising a fresh Spanish army, marching it into Germany to defeat the Swedish-led Protestant forces at the Battle of Nordlingen in 1634, the increased tensions with France made war between the two Catholic states increasingly inevitable. Olivares advised Philip that the coming war with France would be all or nothing. Spain would win or fall by the result. The Spanish-French War that ensued from 1635 onwards was not a foregone conclusion. Early Spanish successes threatened Paris, and, even after the Spanish defeat at Rocroi, Spain remained a strong opponent. But from 1640 onwards, a period which saw large-scale revolts across Spanish territories in protest against the rising costs of the conflict, Spain was finding it difficult to sustain the war. Philip reacted to the increased French threat by finally abandoning his Netherlands First strategy. Resources for the Army of Flanders were savagely cut, and the fight against the French-supported rebels Catalonia took the first priority. Shortly after Rocroi, Philip, now having had to dismiss his favourite, Olivares, issued instructions to his ambassadors to seek a peace treaty. The Peace of Westphalia, delivered by Olivares' replacement Louis de Haro, resolved the long-running 80 Years' War in the Netherlands and the wars in Germany, but the conflict with France dragged on. Philip responded to the perceived weakness of France during the Fronde rebellions of 1648 by continuing the fight. He took personal responsibility for the decision to start a fresh, and ultimately successful, offensive against the French in Catalonia in 1651. True victory over France never emerged, however, and by 1658, after the loss of Dunkirk to an Anglo-French force, Philip was personally desperate for peace. The Treaty of the Pyrenees in 1659, and the marriage of Philip's daughter Maria Theresa to the young King Louis XIV finally brought his long-running European wars to an end. Philip and the Spanish military. By the late 1620s, the Spanish army was no longer as dominant on the battlefield as it once had been. The feared tertio regiments, composed of well-disciplined pikemen, were increasingly appearing inflexible and outmoded in the face of the new Swedish and Dutch formations with a higher proportion of musketeers. Philip and Olivares attempted to address the perceived weaknesses of the army, which they concluded were primarily due to the falta de cabezas, or a lack of leadership. In keeping with their wider agenda of renewing the concepts of duty, service and aristocratic tradition, the king agreed to efforts to introduce more grandees into the higher ranks of the military, working hard to overcome the reluctance of many to take up field appointments in the Netherlands and elsewhere. The results were not entirely as hoped. The grandees dragooned into service in this way were disinclined to spend years learning the normal professional military skill set. They wished to start out as generals and soldiers on the same day. To quote one disgruntled career soldier, by the 1630s, the king was waiving the usual rules to enable promotion to higher ranks on a shorter time scale, and having to pay significantly inflated salaries to get grandees to take up even these appointments. The performance of these officers at battles such as Rocroi left much to be desired. Philip was also notable for his interest in the Spanish Armada, or Navy. Shortly after taking power he began to increase the size of his fleets, rapidly doubling the size of the naval budget from the start of his reign, then tripling it. Philip is credited with a sensible, pragmatic approach to provisioning and controlling it. He was prepared to involve himself in considerable details of naval policy. He was commenting on the detail of provisions for the Armada in 1630. For example, the Junta de Armadas was the only junta committee to survive the fall of Olivares intact. Even after the disastrous Battle of the Downs, Philip remained closely interested in his navy, including ensuring ministerial attention. In 1646, de Haro was personally involved in supplying and equipping the Atlantic Fleet from Cadiz. Throughout the period there was no weakening of the importance attached to naval forces by the king, who argued that joint land and naval operations were essential. Some of his conclusions on naval policy were quite advanced. After the Peace of 1648, Philip argued that the Dutch fleets off the Spanish peninsula were actually good for trade, despite concerns from his senior officials, since they provided protection against the English and French navies.